planning transit routes and evaluating existing routes. Mark?
Thank you, Camille, and let me add my thanks as well to everyone for joining in this afternoon as our first webinar doing this, and I know we've all probably participated as well as listened in, so hope things go smoothly for you. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the connection between land use and transit planning. A bit about myself to provide some context. Most of my professional career has been spent on the land use side. I worked for Guilford County Planning for a number of years and joined PART in 2008. So I've been with PART about 8 years now. So I say prior to that I was in the land use side of things, and since joining PART I've gotten obviously more engaged in transportation and transit planning. So one of the things that I like to do whenever I'm talking about transportation and land use is just kind of talk about, you know, something that is probably fairly obvious to all of us, and that is our development pattern that has been occurred over the last 50 to 60 years has caused a lot of transportation headaches for us. Sprawl, suburban development, has caused congested highways, and historically we have tried to build ourselves out of that congestion by improving our automobile infrastructure. And what we have learned is that just causes even more congestion, and that it's not a real sustainable solution. So one of the mantras that I like to talk about is, you know, creating a multitude of choices for people to provide them the freedom and access to all that they need to have a successful life, jobs, food, health care. And this is a new paradigm that we continue to have to try to shift to, and we've done a lot to get to the place to where we have the types of communities that are walkable, that are transit friendly, that have the types of services and things that are very nearby us. And I always think about the sort of elderly couple that's in the lower right-hand corner there and wonder what they're talking about. And this may or may not be what they're actually talking about. If that was me 20 years from now, that might be. But I think the message here is clear, is that we can build better communities, but we're going to have to overcome some of the land use obstacles that we've had in the past. So we'll look at that intersection between transit and land use. We'll talk about some route design considerations, new data, and some new toys that we have in transit planning. This particular diagram or graphic is one to me that illustrates the great challenge, and that is our road network is not set up for anything but other than cars. So even if we're trying to walk to school or take a bus to school or to the market, our transportation infrastructure and the land use development patterns that we have set up really create barriers towards that. But there is hope, and a lot of that hope can be seen right here in North Carolina, and it really all starts with a plan or a vision. This is the plan and vision that Charlotte adopted a number of years ago, and back in 2010, and it is what has sort of led to its light rail and streetcar system now. It doesn't have a lot of detail. It identifies some corridors and some technologies that might go in that corridor, but from that vision, they've been able to build a world-class transit system there. One of the things that we talk about a lot with our land use, and we'll talk about transit-oriented development more in a moment, is that sort of mixed-use, multi-story type of development. This is something that existed in our downtowns, no matter what size of town or community you have or you live in. You can find these multi-story buildings that have shops on the first floor, residential up above them. And within the last 10 years, we've been moving back towards that type of development pattern. And one of the great things about this particular development pattern, if you're a city or a community of any size, is that it actually increases the tax base. The per acre value of this type of development far exceeds the per acre value of a single family low density subdivision, of the Kmart, of the Walmart. It's a little bit different way of thinking things in terms of a per acre value, but there's been a number of studies that have been done that indicate that this type of development pattern is preferred. So again, the message here is getting back to the form of development that we started off with many decades ago really has some advantage. And that is the type of development that you typically see or associate with transit-oriented development. And again, using a local example of Charlotte, this is a shot in their South Boulevard Blue Line corridor that has been developed over the years, and they have just seen a tremendous investment from a development standpoint within that corridor. And all that means additional tax revenue and dollars for the city to be able to provide public services and other things that cities do for their residents. So that was a real chicken and egg story. The development started occurring before the transit actually got there, but it occurred because of that promise and that commitment and investment in the transit. And then, of course, since the transit has gone in, it has spurred even more development. So in this case, transit is responsible for changing that land use development pattern into something that is more sustainable. When we think about our neighborhoods and a lot of our communities, one of the tough things about city planning and development comes with rezonings, and that is changing the land use from one category to another. And a lot of times it even involves residential land uses. So you've probably heard of zoning battles where the single-family neighborhood doesn't like the apartment complexes coming in and things of that nature. So we see a lot of these battles in infill development in our more urban core, but it is this type of sort of multi-story residential development that, again, can be more sustainable and is more directly linked to a walkable neighborhood as well as a more transit-friendly neighborhood. Unfortunately, my city of Greensboro, by walk score, is identified as a car-dependent city, but my neighborhood is there pictured on the right, and my house is one house down there from the left, and it has a walk score up in the 70s. So even within a car-dependent city, there are locations and there are styles of development that create a very walkable community. The diagram at the bottom is meant to show that for the most part, we have developed a lot of detached single-family homes, which is there on the left-hand side. And then, at least in our area, we get more of the multiplex or multi-building apartment units, but there's a whole wide range of housing types that you can probably find in your city, from duplexes to triplexes to bungalows to townhouses that are existing within your community that could be built and become of that walkable, transit-friendly neighborhood. Development-oriented transit, some of you may have heard of this term, some of you may have not, but unlike transit-oriented development, where you're trying to put in a transit to create a development pattern, this is a concept where you're actually putting the transit technology in to meet what you believe is the future land use within that corridor. So every community can't have a high-density transit-oriented corridor. There is just simply not enough growth and investment within a community to have every corridor that way. So sometimes light rail, for example, is not the answer. Sometimes a bus rapid transit is not the answer. Sometimes the answer is just an express bus. So this concept, again, is looking at your land use pattern, and instead of maybe trying to change it with some different transit technology, actually enhance what you have, what you want to develop there with the appropriate transit technology. Another thing that comes into play here, in my mind, particularly with transit planning and how we're developing our communities now, is the type of housing that millennials as well as others are looking for these days. And we all know the great shift from the suburban area into the more urban core. And we know from numerous surveys, from Realtors Association to the American Planning Association, and you probably have several others on your desk, that millennials and the younger generation are looking for more walkable neighborhoods. They're looking to use transit more. But that also applies to a great deal to my generation, that being the baby boomers. As we continue to age, we're also interested in having other mobility options. So it is really a prime time for us to be able to do some transit planning and look at our land use and communities and enhance them and make them even better. One myth about daily travel that we use a lot in terms of when we're talking to people about transit and how our transit networks and systems should work is that only 21% of personal travel is related to commuting. So I know in the situation of PART, well, I'll show a graphic of our system in a moment, it is mostly the commuting public that is using our system. But again, that's only a small percentage of the overall trips. So transit is not just there to get people to work. We can design transit systems to provide other types of trips other than just commuting. So what are the 7 demands of transit? And I have to give credit to some others here, including Jarrett Walker, for this. But there are a number of different things that people ask themselves as they're trying to decide whether to use transit or not. Is it a good use of money? Can I trust it? Can it give me the freedom to change my plans? Will it take me where I want to go? Will it make me feel respected? Will it take me, is it a good use of my time? So all of these factors come into play anytime that we walk out the door. And of course, 90% of the time we're grabbing our keys, but we're still wondering, you know, how am I going to get to where I need to go? But when you're switching and giving the keys to someone else and wanting to use transit, all these things come into your mind as to whether or not that makes a successful transit trip. And Jared and some others have sort of broken that down, this where, when, time, money, respect, and trust, into different ways that transit systems respond to that, whether it's the frequency of a route, where the bus stops and stations are located, is it reliable, are you treating people with respect, are they secure, you know, what is the fare? And so when you look at all the reasons or all the questions that people ask themselves and the way that we can respond, there are 3 that I focus in on. One is the frequency, and frequency just means ridership. The more frequently a service is running, the greater the ridership is going to be. How seamless and how you can connect to other modes, whether it's from your home to the bus or to a rail, or whether you're biking and getting on the bus. That connectivity is so important. And then, of course, where the bus system goes or where the transit system goes and what it actually connects you is equally important. So when you're looking at frequency, these are the types of things that come into play. When you're looking at the geographic coverage, these are the things that come into play. And then ultimately, it's all about freedom. If you're touching on most of these things, it all relates back down to freedom. So having the freedom to be able to catch the transit system when you need to, having it go where it needs to, having it get you there in a timely manner, and then it being reliable in terms of being able to get you back, that all equates down to freedom. And giving people the freedom of the choice is what we hope all of our transit systems do. So this is a quick schematic of the PART system. We are a commuter express system that covers 6 to 8 counties all the way up from Mount Airy and Surrey, and we have a route that goes all the way over to Chapel Hill. We are based right here in the middle of the Piedmont Triad, so our service really extends out. So a couple of years ago, we went down this path of doing a much more detailed analysis of our routes, as well as planning routes. And up in the upper left-hand corner is information that's been available for a couple censuses now, so a couple decades, and that is the number of people that are commuting from county to county. And if you were to pull this information up for your own county, as we've done for our region, you can start to see, particularly in the Piedmont Triad, where the counties surrounding Guilford and Forsyth are all wanting to commute into Forsyth and Guilford. But that just really gave us a total number of people commuting. It really didn't talk to whether people would use transit or where they were going to within that particular county. Then there was that concept of the cost of housing and transportation, whereas the further you lived from your place of employment would certainly increase your transportation cost, and for the most part, the closer you lived into a city, the higher your housing cost was. So what a lot of this data began to show us, again, that when you live out further in the suburban areas, that the cost of transportation just really outweighs the savings that you might have in terms of living out. Then you get transit propensity, which is a calculation that starts to help you see the frequency that you could use within your transit. And then now there is something called LEHD, which we use a lot. It's on the map. It's a census product, and it really gets into the detail in terms of where people live and work. Connecting this back to the land use, we use the transit shed. Most everyone's familiar with the quarter-mile walk distance, but we also use a 1 to 3 mile biking distance and then a 5 to minute driving distance to park and ride lots. And because of the way our system is structured, we felt we had to develop some different ways to project ridership. And one way is something that we call a projected ridership, which is basically taking your current ridership and adding a level of service factor to that to get a new ridership. So again, as you increase the frequency, it increases the ridership. We also use a much more detailed ridership analysis that looks at the potential ridership. And this is basically a technique of going in and looking at the number of people that are within a 5-minute drive of our park and ride lots, or within a quarter mile of the park and ride lots, or a bus stop, and then applying some other factors to it and coming up with a potential number of people that would ride transit. And you may be wondering how those equations work out. They're working out fairly well. One thing, for example, that it has shown us on a fairly low ridership route, that would be Route 13 there in Yadkin, even though that it's low ridership, it's a very sparsely populated county, and we're really realizing about 81% of the ridership we think now that is actually achievable. So we're having to evaluate that route and say, this is the ridership that we're going to get. Are we able to maintain or sustain that? Compare that to a Route 4, which is our route that goes from Greensboro over to Chapel Hill, a little bit about a year old now, very popular, and we've already busted out the roof of what we projected in terms of the ridership to be. A new tool that is available to folks is called Remix. It does have a cost to it, but I think it's a very worthwhile tool. It is something that we use here. It is something that you can use from a public engagement standpoint, but also it automatically, you can just draw transit lines and get a lot of information in terms of the people that you're serving, the miles of the route, the number of buses that you need, and it's become a tool that we're relying on as we're working through a complete system-wide revision. And then a brand new tool that we're in the early stages of using is called TBEST, or the Transit Boarding Estimation and Simulation Tool. We've been working in partnership with the state planning agency at DOT and the modeling group. And here within the Piedmont Triad, this model has been calibrated towards all of our current services for PART, WISTA, HITRAN, as well as GTA. And we're getting into it now and using it to look at some different transit scenarios and system design scenarios to look at ridership and to be able to make some determinations. This is a very powerful tool in terms of looking at economic development as well and the types of development that could occur around transit, and we're just getting into the tip of the iceberg in terms of using it. but it uses a lot of the information and data from a lot of the other sources that I just kind of touched on. So that's my connection between land use and transit and some of the tools that we're currently using. And again, the main message is it's all about freedom. This is a screenshot from that Remix tool, and basically it allows you to look at and see how far someone is able to access the community with the transit system. So they called that little person Jane, and from this screenshot, the isometric rings are at 15, 30, 45, and 60-minute intervals. So if you see where Jane is there on the right-hand side, and you see the bigger dot there on the left with the dark blue, light blue, and red around it, that's our hub. And so what it is showing is that Jane can get from Greensboro at the Four Seasons Mall to our hub in 30 minutes. And then you can see the other isometric rings. So again, it's a great tool, but it is all about land use and the transportation network that you have in place and being able to provide people freedom. So with that, I'm going to turn the presentation controls over to John Talmadge.
Thank you, Mark. For the first presentation, that was great information on mixed-use development, transit-oriented development as it relates to community investments, rezoning, and mitigation for some of the transit headaches, and also the 7 demands of transit. The second session will be presented by John Talmadge. The session will be called The Triangle Experience. John Talmadge is the Director of Regional Services Development for Go Triangle. John will discuss Go Triangle's role in coordinating transit route planning amongst the transit agencies in the Triangle. He will highlight some of the disconnects and challenges between new development and transit systems, and also serving new development with transit service. John?
Thank you, Camille. Go Triangle is the regional public transportation provider in the 3-county area of Wake, Durham, and Orange counties, where Raleigh, Durham, Cary, Chapel Hill are located. And each of the local governments is also operating a public transportation system: Raleigh, Cary, Durham, Chapel Hill, and there are university systems at Duke and at NC State. And the 7 of us have to work together to create a system that functions for our customers. And we've made strides at being better coordinated over the years, and I want to talk about one aspect of that today, and that's really our relationship with Durham, and then from that role, the interactions with other city staff, particularly the planning staff at the City of Durham. Back in 2010, the City of Durham contracted with Go Triangle to provide planning, marketing, and oversight of the contractor that provides transit services in the city. And so in addition to our planning regional transit, we got into the responsibility of planning local transit for the City of Durham. And that has introduced us to a lot of new responsibilities in terms of shaping the transit network. And what I'm going to focus on is the relationship building with city planning staff, and really a lesson for all of us in how important those relationships are, and to extend them first outside of your organization, particularly with planning staff, but then to other types of organizations that affect how we deliver service to our customers. So we operate within jurisdictions, we all operate within jurisdictions that have largely been formed without consideration of how people can move around the city without a car. And even though that there are lots of different forces at work in forming our towns and cities, there is a public planning process in every municipality, every county, in North Carolina. And that establishes the rules of the game, and then the planning staff guide players, both private and public, through that game based upon those development rules. And this image here I liked because for a lot of us, the planning process is a strangely foreign operation. It's got its own language, it's got its own rules and customs, and they can be hard to engage in. And it's like the knights at the round table here. And it's important for transit to find its seat at that table and begin to understand the processes, the language, so that transit becomes more integral to decision making. All too often, when transit agencies try to engage in the planning process, it's a case of missed connections, or it can feel that way. A lot of our experience working with the City of Durham on development issues has been learning about a development and saying, looking at our system and realizing there's a bus stop in the vicinity, and it would be great if we could get the developer to put in a shelter, or to put in a crosswalk and put a shelter on the other side. And sometimes we come to the planning staff and we're told it's too late in the process, that those decisions were made a long time ago, and we can't make any more requirements on the developer. There are other times where we come and we've got this right stage of the process, but we're told either there's no rational nexus, there's no connection that's in scale of what we're asking for with what the developer or the property owner wants to do. Sometimes we come and it's the right time of the process and it's the right scale, but the code doesn't require that sort of improvement, the type of improvement that we're requesting to be done, and there's limited action that the planning staff can take. And so all of these things are they're frustrating as you go through the process, but it is a learning process, and it begins to form the relationships that are needed to get improvements as we move forward. I wanted to share a few examples of why this is so important to get this right by showing some examples where we didn't get it right. This first one is from quite some time ago. This precedes our involvement with the City of Durham, and we don't know the particulars of what the communication was between transit staff and the developers, or excuse me, and the planning staff. But the outcome is important to look at, because this is often what happens. That a developer came in and wanted to build affordable housing in a private development, and located it and looked at a map and said, it's close to bus stops. And so that became, they were able to move forward and build it. But it's a half a mile. So even though we might say that within a half a mile is access to a bus stop, there's no sidewalk in this particular location. And it's a 2-lane road, and it isn't well lit, and the side has swales, it's not curb and gutter. And so every day there are about 20 people that are walking this half mile in each direction to get to the nearest bus stop. And what's often asked of the transit agency is, can you just extend the route to capture those 20 people so they don't have to walk? And the problem is, in a situation like this, and it's often the situation, that this is part of a longer route. This is one of the most well-utilized routes in the whole Durham system. It connects downtown. It connects the second highest use stop in the system, called the Village Shopping Center. And if we extend this route, we're going to make the route less reliable for everybody else who uses the route. We could extend sidewalk connection, or recommend that the City of Durham extend sidewalk connection, but that would be expensive, and it's one of many, many priorities on the city's sidewalk priority list. And so it's really important to get these things right when the private development is coming in so that you can get the improvements from them at the right time. Another example, this goes beyond just the planning process to relationships with social service organizations. And this is a case where vocational rehab services located in an inexpensive property that was along one of our bus routes, but it's a route that's served only once an hour, and it's served in one direction. And as congestion increased in our community, being at the end of the route, it was a place where we wanted to look to reduce travel time. And so when you look at this, and what we know the social services agency looked at was really just the costs for themselves, and this is cheap rent, and they didn't pay attention to what their clients and our customers' experience was like. And this is not a very high quality service that we're able to provide because it's on the periphery of the city. There's not a lot of demand for other areas out in that part of the city. And so this is a case, it's an example where we need to start with improving the relationships with planning staff, but extend it to other key partners in our jurisdictions. And the key partners are going to be different for everybody, but you need to think through who those are for your customer base. The point here is to think about who those relationships need to be with. If it's a decision-making organization, when do they make decisions? Who makes the decisions? How do you enter into that process that belongs to another organization? And then once you've had some practice with that, how do you institutionalize this working together so that it's not dependent upon your current relationship with a staff person who's there, and it'll fall apart when that staff person leaves or when you turn over and move into a different position. And a few examples of how to institutionalize these relationships are going back to the planning process. So this is looking at their decision making and who is involved with doing review and getting notices when it's appropriate to provide comments. So what we've been able to do with the City of Durham is, in addition to their internal routing of rezoning or site plan requests, Go Triangle also gets that so that we can become part of the process. The City of Raleigh does it a little bit differently. They have a transit staff person, Carmelie Scarpitti, who is actually more or less embedded with the development review team. So as they're getting him, she's sitting side by side and making comments about what the transit opportunities are, what the transit needs are for their customers at that site. Other ways to go beyond the development review is to then, as you're learning where there are weaknesses, engaging with the city planning staff in updating their development ordinances so that you're even building in that relationship deeper into the language that's actually in the legal ordinance. And those can be things like that the developer has to get approval from the transit agency if you're an outside organization, or that they have to do a transportation impact analysis, not just a traffic impact analysis, which then, and Charlotte has had success with this, gets them to think about the transit needs across the street on some, not just on their property. And then finally, and this can be for any relationship, is committing to regularly making contacts, connections with your key partners so that you're reminding them of that you're there and identifying opportunities to continue working together. One of the key messages that we've found in working with other partners is this idea of siting the development or the business on the way of the existing route, and not trying to be close and then asking the transit agency to divert to come off. And this slide is taken from Jarrett Walker and Associates, his book, Human Transit. It's an important idea, and I think that the way he phrases it is something that others can understand. And too often what we're told is, can't you just add a stop on the route? And what they mean is, can't you take the route 2 blocks off of its current alignment to come closer to our front door? And the impacts of that on reliability and travel time for everybody else are significant. And so getting your partners to understand that, whether they're citing a social service or citing a housing development, citing shopping center business, that's key. And I want to leave you with a few examples that have been positive. This first one with the City of Durham, because they have a requirement that's embedded in their ordinance that large retail locations provide park and ride. This regional mall, Streets at South Point, was committed to providing park and ride spaces and access through their site and bus stops and amenities. And this was served both by Go Durham and Go Triangle. And so having that codified is critical to, one, getting it at the outset, but two, and continuing relationships with the planning staff allows for monitoring, because this is a property manager that frankly doesn't want the transit on its property and does a number of things to try and move us off or move us to further to the outskirts of the property. And because we have good relationships with the planning staff, with the transportation staff, we're able to have them reiterate to the property manager, this is a requirement, it's legally binding to you, you can't make a change unless you come back and get council approval. On the more informal front, this is Bob Giolis, the former CEO of the Research Triangle Foundation that owns Research Triangle Park. And they are trying to reinvent themselves to be a more urban place, and they're starting with one particular site. And because of relationships that our organization has built with Research Triangle Foundation, it helps feed why they want to bring a transit center and have that integral to their development. And this is an exciting opportunity for us, and we're starting off on the feasibility front of working with them to make it a key element of their redevelopment of that area of Research Triangle Park. And then finally, extending beyond, as you build these relationships and you get through some of the basic issues, some areas like downtown Durham, you're able to move beyond just the building locations or design to other strategies. So TDM is transportation demand management, and that is things like incentives. So there's an image of a Go Pass where the institution pays for their tenants, their employees to ride transit. American Tobacco is one of the highlights of redevelopment of downtown Durham, and their property manager entered into a Go Pass agreement with us for all of their tenant companies to have Go Passes. American Underground is one of those tenants, and it's become a core part of how they attract people because there's so little parking. So the relationships, as you invest in them, pay dividends not only in good development decisions, good siting decisions, but as you nurture them in other aspects that can build an excellent transit network and be good for your customers. And that is my key message, that we need to invest in these relationships. There are lots of potential relationships. You need to make decisions about what's most important for your organization, and then find the time to build those relationships and nurture them over the years. Thank you, and I will pass it back.
Thank you, John. Thank you for the information regarding connecting transit with community partners, incorporating transit into development, and really, basically, simply put, working together. The third session, or the third presentation, will be presented by Brian Horton, planner for Charlotte Area Transit. His presentation is called Transit Planning Coordination, Charlotte Area Transit Station Area Plans, Bus Service Planning Coordination. Brian will discuss the integration and coordination amongst the city departments that work collaboratively on route planning and installation of amenities such as bus shelters. He will also discuss how the transit system has impacted the land use and current route planning around the Blue Line rail extension. Brian?
Thanks, Camille. So I'm going today to give an overview of the Charlotte experience. When I do that, I want to talk about how kind of the Charlotte Transit Agency is structured, how we work closely with other departments in Charlotte, how we've really linked land use and transportation through our station area planning and our overall growth framework, and more importantly, how we then coordinate improvements to support bus services and rail service, and then ultimately how we then adopt or change or adjust our planning, our bus services, and the bus stops, the quality bus stops that we often get through development. So many transit agencies are authorities, but not always, and most agencies have their own governing boards. CATS is kind of a hybrid. We are part of the City of Charlotte, so we do have a city budgeting process, and we get to work very closely with other city departments. However, we also have a county half-cent sales tax as our primary local funding source, and through that we established a county board of directors. And so often when we go for decisions, we have to go both to our city council as well as our county board for kind of a policy vote. But the benefit of being a city department is that we work very closely with all the various city agencies, and also by being a county agency, if you will, through our board, we get to coordinate with surrounding towns also in the principal urban county. And this has really paid off in terms of how we better link land use and transportation, which is really the Charlotte success story, that we have greatly planned, closely planned, how land use is influence and the form and shape and where growth should be around planned transit corridors. And so it's not just about land use though, because uses, it's important what their design is in terms of how they are oriented to pedestrians. A walk-friendly, pedestrian-friendly environment is very key for transit. Even if you have transit customers who are park and ride customers at one station or stop, we are all, as transit users, pedestrians. And really builds a better place for all, not just transit customers, but really for the urban experience. And mobility, that transit improvements aren't the only improvement necessary, that really the first mile, last mile that makes a full, sustainable city work is that there are those bicycle and pedestrian connections of an overall improved complete street network. So how do we go about doing this? In Charlotte, we have land use policies that help guide development. And historically, we've done that largely around our rail corridors through the station area plan process. As you can see on this slide, we look at kind of what is the high level on the top graphic, was the high level development areas. And it's important too, as part of that conversation, when you're trying to direct growth, that you also think about areas where maybe you don't want so much growth, areas that need to be preserved versus the balance of where infill is appropriate or densification would be appropriate. And so that kind of creates a concept, and it gets more fine-grained into the development plan. And more lesson learned, we've only had light rail in operation in Charlotte since 2007. We are now extending that light rail line. We have learned that we need more detail for that development, that form matters, that how the buildings relate to the streets matter. And so we've now developed a structure plan as well. And ultimately, what I'm going to talk about more is the mobility plan. That's not just about the land use or the buildings and the design, but ultimately other supporting transportation. So where did we start? Mark had a slide that showed the growth corridors framework of Charlotte. That was a great start in the 90s. Charlotte benefits, it's a good problem to have by having rapid growth, probably the highest growth east of Texas in the US right now. And with the conversation with Charlotteans or residents, we basically were able to say, where should that growth go? And so transit was a key part of that vision, that if Charlotte was going to remain an attractive place, a growing place of economic development and growing jobs and people, that we needed to have better linkages between transit and land use. But not everywhere needed to be a super dense place, that we could still have suburban wedges that are very much the auto-oriented lifestyle, but also nodes and corridors of more denser development. And so that evolved into kind of principles of how to develop station areas. And most importantly, at the bottom, you'll see that we developed multiple tools to apply this policy. And surprisingly, Charlotte does not have a form-based code. We actually just have a regular Euclidean basic regular zoning code where uses are separated. We are developing currently a unified development ordinance, but it's still in development. So we kind of created these fixes or band-aids, if you will, but really creatively, innovatively came up with additional zoning categories and overlays to kind of work with the existing zoning code that we already had. And one of those is transit-oriented development zoning, or TOD zoning. And the Transit Authority actually has sign-off on any plans and gets to review those plans, and that's a requirement. But we have such good coordination with our city departments, we actually get to be an advisory review even on other developments that are coming in for other rezoning or other by right processes. And place matters. A variety of places are part of that fabric that creates a metropolitan economy. That not everywhere is the high density, very walkable place, but all places need to be quality places, places for economic activity and attractive places to live and play and work. And all these areas can be served by transit, but in different ways, of course. Lower density places or open spaces would not have as much transit. And there you need to create kind of nodes that become the walkable centers from which you can gather residents and jobs. Low or spread out industrial uses may have to have variants or specialized transit trips that really are accommodating like shift changes of work employees. But we really wanted to see where can we get good infill, especially along arterial thoroughfares. Those are the linear, stroads or roadways often built in the post-war environment around the car that could transition and infill with more urban, more walkable, denser development, more mixed-use development. And so that's a lot of place types you see in the middle that would help guide land use that would support more transit. And it's not just about land use, it's also about the capital infrastructure. So while CATS, the Charlotte Area Transit System, is able to get a lot of transit improvements, bus stop improvements through land development, we also get a lot of those improvements through the city capital projects themselves. And sometimes the transit project is part of that overall approach, that when there's a light rail line or streetcar line as pictured in these examples, that there's supporting infrastructure on the pedestrian environment surrounding those projects. But other times those projects are actually smaller projects, and I'll get to that in a minute. It's important to note that too, that we have a lot of bus stops, of course, and across a lot of jurisdictions, but I just want to give you our perspective. The vast majority of our bus stops are primarily in one jurisdiction. But this model of how we've worked with our own city has really extended well to the surrounding towns, that we now also have good coordination with their planning and public works groups to try to get bus stop improvements and bus service planning decisions made as part of the land use, land development review, or capital project, road project bond review processes. So how do we improve these bus stops? Sometimes it is the transit agency doing it ourselves. Sometimes, as you see at the top, we are investing in key priority locations like key transfer hubs. Or other times we're just following up on customer requests where maybe we're there first and the pedestrian environment is lacking. So we actually have to look at how do we address ADA issues in those cases. But often, of course, other people's money is nice. So often we partner. We both partner with other public agencies, often city like Public Works or departments of transportation with their widening projects, their streetscape projects, their intersection projects. But we also get to leverage private development, especially development patterns that are more urban in nature and really are intensifying the uses. And in fact, this example of these two pictures is the same area, a bus stop just a block apart, and one just happened to be done by public sector and the other by private development. So where are we now? We've had good lessons from our success story on the original South Corridor line, where we've had a lot of TOD and become a national model for land use being built around transit. But we are applying those lessons now as we extend our blue line, and that is going to more than double our light rail line. It has about 11 new stations, and many of those stations, though, do not have park and ride, as you can see on this slide. So it's very important that we maximize bus connections as well as the land use walk access of those stations. And so we are tinkering with a lot of routes. This is kind of the existing pattern. As you can see, it's a spaghetti mess of routes. We don't have a super grid infrastructure of thoroughfares in Charlotte. It's a lot of squiggly lines of arterials, and we're trying to clean that up. We can also maybe see from this picture we have kind of a spider single hub and spoke system that's really focused on the central business district. That would be in the lower left-hand corner of that map, because this is really not a full system map. This is just looking at routes kind of north and east of that central business district where the rail extension is. And so this is a really good opportunity, especially with the rail line transecting our CBD for the first time all the way across the city, to really reorient away from that single hub and spoke system to now a cross-town, better connected, gridded system. But of course, one of the challenges we're doing that, we still have to look at land use patterns and potential travel demand. And so when we're looking at that, we do still see there are a lot of radial corridors still in the land use patterns. Even though, transit may be moving away from hub and spoke, a lot of past patterns were with the radial highways and thoroughfares that reinforce those patterns. So probably a lot of the transit levels of service will still be oriented in a radial pattern, but we do see opportunities to create strong crosstowns. And so when we, and this is a ridership heat map that's the background, when we look at potential new routes, we're seeing, well, where could we maybe extend coverage, but we're finding that we're challenged, of course, in a cost-constrained scenario of where we can go, and that's really the local political will. You may be fortunate enough to be in although very few places are, be fortunate enough in a place that is increasing their funding for transit, but often most places are kind of stuck with the budget they have or very minimal increases year to year. And so when you try to restructure your bus system in that type of environment, it is often sometimes a exercise of trying to find where you can cost effectively shift resources, where you can you have a route that's low performing and you can maybe try to reinvest those hours or try to develop a new service, and then still trying to balance that with what's the minimum level of service. With a lot of the system in Charlotte oriented around our rail spine, we really want to provide a minimum level of service that the hours largely match that rail. The rail is going to be a high-frequency corridor that offers good service all day and weekends. So we want, of course, the bus service to match that, and ideally have as much high-frequency corridors as possible, which is about 15 minutes or better. But we're finding, of course, is as you struggle, I'm sure, in your community of the coverage versus frequency trade-off, that there's a lot of political push to maintain coverage or add coverage, which eats, of course, into that frequency budget. So Charlotte gets a lot of glamour for all the shiny new stuff of people moving here. That helps. But we do, of course, like many communities across the U.S., challenge with those same challenges or struggles that you have, that often many of our general public don't use transit. So a lot of your political will is for non-users, and you have to appeal to a broader base. And we always start there. We try to develop services that appeal to all and try to attract more new customers. And we really seek out champions in our community. And that helps when we also build a quality product that maybe sometimes less is more, quality instead quantity, that we are investing more in those bus stops, those transfer hubs, because that is part of the transit experience. Of course, it's a great transit experience when you're on the bus or train and moving quickly, but often how you wait and catch that bus or train is a big part of that experience as well. And how we build our transit infrastructure and interweave it into our urban community really can make transit then an integral piece of the overall urban fabric of our community. And I provide some slides. Here's my contact information. A lot of the planning coordination is through our land use planning group, and her contact information is provided there as well.
Thank you, Brian, for the great information linking land use and transportation with public partners to coordinate improvements. The next area that we'll discuss today is the question and answer. I'm not sure if the questions are open for everyone, the question section. If it's not, you can type your question in the chat section. Mark is looking into that to see if that needs to be unlocked, but for me it's not unlocked. If you could please type your question in the chat section if you do have any questions. If you do leave the webinar before the question and answer session is over, please do fill out the survey. Otherwise, we will wait for the first question, and then we will open up the audio. So far, we have not received any questions.
Hey, Camille, it's Mark.
Hey.
I can see a question in my box here, and I think this is probably for John or Brian, and I'll read it out. It's, when an ordinance requires transit amenities in new development, what happens when transit doesn't serve or may not serve that area anytime soon? Are these accommodations still required? I'll tap Brian to jump in first.
Okay. This is Brian. So a lot of our ordinance right now doesn't actually require transit improvements except for the TOD zoning. But we do have good coordination to get comments as part of the rezoning process. And in North Carolina, a lot of communities use what's called the conditional zoning process, where if you rezone, you may have a conditional plan, and with that comes a site plan that has specific notes related to the development. And the transit agency here gets to review those rezonings and often will then put a note, especially in non-TOD zone developments and major generators, larger developments. You know, if somebody's just seeking a zoning for a change of use, and they're not really changing the sidewalk and not really intensifying, you know, the land use patterns, probably don't make a transit comment. But, you know, large multifamily developments, major retail developments, and of course malls and things like that, we definitely try to get conditional notes to get to improvements for bus stops.
This is John. I can tell you what we do in Durham and my understanding what's done in Raleigh. So some of the examples in Durham is we make a judgment about whether to go ahead and have them install, to provide an easement to go ahead and install a paved customer waiting area that meets the ADA requirements. And then if the shelter is often, they can provide us a shelter that we will put in stock that doesn't get installed. Or we can waive the requirement that they put up a shelter. There are some instances where we think there's a likelihood that the service will be extended there or a new route is coming, and we have them go ahead and install the shelter. But they need to a decision needs to be made along those lines, and they can be waived. So the transit agency through the transportation department can say, we don't need the shelter, write a letter to that effect, which waives the requirement for the developer. But they typically need to have those things done before they get a certificate of occupancy. In the city of Raleigh, my understanding is their practice is just to secure the easement so that they can come back later and install a pad and connect it to a sidewalk and install a shelter. That still takes some judgment work about which direction is transit service going to come from. You know, if it's a property that takes up an intersection or it has two sides of an intersection. And unfortunately, you can't we don't have the ability in either of these jurisdictions, and it may not be legally possible in North Carolina to come back later and require them once you do know what the service is going to look like.
Thank you, John. Mark, do you see any other questions?
No.
Okay, great. If we end up getting a question, I'll go back to it. But otherwise, just to wrap up, this is the first webinar hosted by the NCPTA Training Committee. The Training Committee intends on providing a space on the membership portal located in the NCPTA website. Both the webinar and PowerPoint presentations will be uploaded to the portal training page for future reference. If you have not signed up for the website, please go to the chat box and click on the link for nctransit.org/member-only-area. If you have any ideas for other webinars or training, please email Mark Kirshner with your ideas. Mark, John, Brian, would you like to add anything else? Okay.
Thank you for this opportunity.
Oh, thank you. Fantastic presentations today. Thank you for your time, and also thank you for the presentations. And to the participants, thank you for participating in the webinar. We're really excited to have the opportunity to provide peer-to-peer webinars online, and please don't hesitate to go and provide as much information as you can into the survey so that we can provide future webinars and training. I hope you all have a great day, and thank you for participating.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.